Emanuele Ottolenghi is a senior fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He joins us now from Washington with reaction to the report. Let's talk about the fact that there are reasonable grounds in this report. That's what they're saying, reasonable grounds to assume chemical weapons have been used. What do they mean by reasonable grounds? What are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about evidence collected on the ground and interviews with survivors that give a strong indication that this is indeed what we've seen, and this is no news. I think that what matters here, because of course we had reports previously of use of chemical weapons in this conflict. What matters here is that the UN has now come authoritatively out to confirm that this was the case, and this of course raises questions both for the United States with the administration having said in the past that the use of chemical weapons was a red line, but also for Russia, which had come out perhaps not as strongly as the United States on this subject, but clearly had stated that chemical weapons were unacceptable. There are international laws preventing the use of such weapons, certainly against civilians. And so this poses a big question to the superpowers, to the international community. Are we going to allow this matter to continue, knowing full well that the weapons, which are obviously in the hands of the regime, have been used against civilians as well as combatants in this conflict?
Well, here's part of the question, I guess, because what the UN is saying is that it looks like both sides have used them at some point. We raise the question then, will the international authorities act? Do you think something like this is enough to force action?
You know, it's interesting because a few weeks ago, when the first indications that chemical weapons had been used, we witnessed an intensive debate as to whether the red line that the U.S. administration had drawn somehow was, had been crossed or not. And what's remarkable about that debate is that we teetered about whether more intervention by the international community was necessary against the evidence of a few dozen people killed by chemical weapons, when 80,000 casualties, largely civilians, by conventional weapons have not triggered any outside interventions. We have 80,000 people killed and counting. We have over 1 million refugees who have left the territory of Syria seeking shelter in neighboring countries. We have, according to UN statistics, over 4 million people who are internally displaced by this conflict. I think that even if evidence of chemical weapons being used was not available, this situation demands greater intervention by the international community to stop this. And unfortunately, what we're witnessing here is one side of the international community, led by Russia and Iran, ignoring the tragedy going on the ground and making sure that every single means at their disposal is put to the service of the Assad regime to continue and escalate this conflict against their opponents as well as civilians, while the rest of the international community is basically sitting on the sidelines.
Well, I guess what we're saying is if one isn't the red line, meaning the sarin gas, then the other is the number of casualties, as you mentioned, we've had in the civil war. Changing topics very quickly, transferring weapons to rebels. Some say we could end up with more human rights violations doing this, or heighten the risk of human rights violations. How do you answer to that?
Listen, the nature of this conflict is one where you have a government that is brutalizing its own people, and a government that has largely, because of it fears that part of its army is no longer reliable, has subcontracted the job of conducting the conflict to pro-government militias that are actively encouraged to actually conduct the conflict with gross human rights violations. On the other side, you have foreign fighters and a ragtag coalition of militia groups opposing the regimes, who have not exactly been schooled in the doctrine of human rights in the midst of warfare. And the nature of this conflict has largely become one of inter-ethnic sectarian violence. So by its nature, this conflict will entail and witness horrific human rights violations. The problem is that, of course, while we can blame both sides for such violations, the origin of this conflict is in the refusal of the Assad regime to listen to the demands of its people, and in the choice of the Assad regime to unleash the full violence of the power of the state and its army against, largely against unarmed civilians. So while this document is very important and it documents very well the atrocities committed on the ground, we have to recognize that unless this regime is removed and it goes, there is no solution, and for the international community to stand on the sides or to presume that by embracing the call of the UN for an arms embargo, the Russians and the Iranians who have been supporting the Assad regime from the start will come along, I think is rather naive.
All right, Emanuele Ottolenghi, thank you for joining us today.